Assalamu alaikum, Carvalho. It's a pleasure to be with you today and to spend the next 40 minutes talking about the future of digital well-being and Generation Z, or Generation Z. I have to start with a correction. I know it's going to be difficult for many of you to believe this, but I am not a member of Gen Z. I'm a cultural anthropologist, and for the last year, I've been working with the Global Council of Gen Z to understand their experiences and expectations of well-being and digital technology. In a few minutes, I will be joined by three incredible panelists to talk about the work that they are doing with this generation. But before they join me, I would like to provide you with three learnings from the work that I've been doing with our Global Council. The first learning comes from a quote from one of our participants. This quote is, "People already think of their devices as an extension of their body." Another one of our Gen Z participants told us, "It used to feel like technology was something in the world, and now it feels like the world is inside of technology." These observations are very important for multiple reasons. They urge us to rethink our understanding and definitions of wellness. Digital life is not seen as a separate domain of experience for this generation. It is tangled and twisted and knotted up with their everyday experience. It makes us question how we define well-being. We would argue that we would need to add an additional dimension to the World Health Organization's definition of wellness. That is, in addition to mental, social, physical, spiritual, and financial wellness, we need to add digital well-being to that understanding. Now, the second learning and area of attention is one that many of us have been speaking about in the corridors of the summit. Well-being is closely linked to a person's sense of purpose, believing that they belong to something larger than themselves. You might call it religious or spiritual, or even just a place in the order of things. When we asked our Gen Z council about the effects of digital life on their spiritual well-being, their responses were mostly negative. One participant told us, "These two things are contradictory. Spiritual well-being cannot be found anywhere near smart devices. It is all within." These young people associate screen time with zoning out, becoming zombies, doing mindless effort. They see this through this language a loss of a sense of self, the idea that digital life distracts us from our grounded spiritual identities. This presents an interesting quandary for the future of our sense of well-being if our spiritual well-being is a void. The third learning I would like to share with you is about the kind of future that these young people are imagining. So we've asked them to create digital technologies that they would like to see in the world ahead. They predict even more digitization, leading to an emergence of something that they have called a hypersensory self. One where our senses are digitized, our sense of smell, taste, and thereby transmittable to others, expanding our sensory capacity. They also propose some new innovations which I'd like to share with you. These are quotes. "We will sometime soon have a sort of headband that projects a screen inside of our heads as if it would be a mental picture. This picture would resemble other thoughts in that we could focus it on our minds, but we would be able to still see the world around us with our eyes." Here's another example. "A simple chip that is implanted into your brain, which gives you the ability to perform every task you could normally do on a smart device, but now in your head and by thought. This device will also be able to alter our perception of reality so we can experience different worlds and different species." And one of my favorites, the One Phone. This is a phone that you will never need to replace. It is modular, so it is easy to update with new components. But more importantly, it is very smart. It detects everything from your language, to your disability, to your income, to your health profile, to provide you immediately with the best interface, apps, and platforms so that you can become self-realized. It is called the One Phone because it is a phone for one and all. Do these ideas sound unbelievable to you? Let me tell you, we did the same exercise in 2014, And by 2018, just 4 short years later, all of those predictions had become real to some extent or another and were available on the market. If these predictions from our young Gen Z council are to become reality, we will very quickly have to redefine our sense of well-being. The world of tech is moving faster than the world of culture, a fact that 90% of our Gen Z respondents confirm when they tell us that technology is moving too fast for us to keep it safe. So those are just 3 of the learnings from our global Gen Z council who we will continue to collaborate with in the years ahead. Now, I would like to go deeper into the future of digital well-being and Gen Z with our 3 incredible panelists. Please help me welcome to the stage Othman Almoamar, board member, ITU Generation Connect, Chantelle de Carvalho, producer and filmmaker, I Am Gen Z, and Larissa May, Lars, founder and executive director, Half the Story. Please welcome them to the stage. Hello. Hello. Hi. Hello. Wow, it's so good to be sitting with the 3 of you here. I can't wait to hear from you and for the audience to learn from you. So a quick opening question for all of you. I'd like to start with an easy one. What have you learned about the future of digital well-being through your work with Gen Z? This could be anything, something surprising, exciting, worrying. Why don't we start with you, Larissa?
Gen Z is living within a paradox of identity. On one hand, they are individuals, they're purveyors of their ideas and are the first generation to have a platform to live their truth and evangelize these ideas with the world. But on the other hand, they're communaholics. And the individualism that they seek in the real world is defined by these digital communities. And I think that the question that begs for the future is, what does individualism look like as we shift from Web 2 to Web 3? And is it about collectivism or individualism as a whole?
Communaholics. Did you take that note down? Communaholics. Very interesting. Chantelle, what about you?
Well, that's very interesting because it's something that we discovered in the film as well, is that, there is a tendency that we look at these teenagers and Gen Z as though they are screen-addicted waifs, which is kind of unfair to them, and they're not. But at the same time, switching off for them is not really an option. There's as much distress caused by switching off because of fear of missing out, etc. But that doesn't mean that they're not using social media, for instance, in a way that helps their digital well-being. And by that I mean they are going onto these communities and these online groups, especially where in the film we do sort of look at the fact that there's ideation now of, self-harm, eating disorders, and sort of suicide ideation, that kind of thing. So these kids are actually using those platforms to try and help each other. And there's a lot of, hey, let's help each other through this. And you're beautiful. And if you don't know this and someone hasn't told you this today, I love you and I'm there for you. And I guess the next step is, how do they, as teenagers and becoming young adults, how do they just translate that now into real practice and come out of the screens and do that? And I believe that they sincerely can do it.
So far, a very good story. Lots of hope. What about you, Uthman?
First of all, assalamu alaikum jami'an. One of the things that I've been working on is a global youth index, which looks at how young people all over the world, mostly in 30 countries, develop. And we look at multiple fields. So we look at digital well-being, we look at health, we look at skills and education, we also look at employment. Now, within the digital arena, 2 things spin off usually on the negative side. The first is the digital literacy side, and the second is the digital well-being as it pertains to mental illness. Now, how do young people utilize digital tools nowadays, especially post-COVID world, to really know about how well they define their own identity, but also how they expand their own self-awareness? And this, in many ways, is one of the areas that are really interesting in the areas that I work in.
Thank you. Now, you're all doing such amazing, different things. Filmmaking, leading a grassroots advocacy organization, policy making. Why are you doing these things? And why focus on Gen Z?
Half the story started 6.5 years ago, and at that point, the world was not even ready for the mental health conversation. I would say at this moment, we are the driest tinder of this digital well-being movement, and the world is ready for it. But the reason why I started Half the Story was because of my own experience. I had hit a rock bottom. I was contemplating my own life on a daily basis, yet I was living my life behind a screen, and no one understood that reality. And the reality that I was facing was one that I guarantee anyone that is watching this, if you have a child, your child is facing too, which is how to identify with my own emotions when I live my life in a digital world. And at Half the Story, our goal as an organization is to give teens the tools that they need when they are struggling socially and emotionally. Because as Simon said earlier, the part of our brain that controls our behaviors is our emotions. And to create real change in this space, it begins with emotional well-being and emotional health to cultivate those behaviors. And that is our mission.
That's so amazing and so useful. That mental health conversation has really taken on a new tone in the last 2 years. So I imagine that Half the Story is reaching a lot of young people. So thanks. What about you, Othman? Why do you do the work that you do with Gen Z?
I work with young people since 2017, 2018, mostly from a research perspective, and really looking at how global young people transform and also evolute to a larger age group. And among those challenges is the digital aspect. Now, when we're talking about millennials and Gen Zs, they're generally grouped together. But in reality, they're very different age groups. One starts from 1981, the other starts in 1996. And each of them deal with technology in a very different way. Now, when you look at it from the Arab world perspective, generally speaking, we actually are a little bit delayed because we're not yet the owners of such technology, and developed countries are much more of an owner of such technologies, and they have access to it earlier. And what I have seen is that within the way that we or young people utilize technology, we treat it similarly, especially from a social media perspective and gaming, similar to how we treat addiction. And similar to the 1980s and 1990s and 2000s, where there was this huge movement towards stopping tobacco, I believe the next movement is actually cheap dopamine, which we get through our use of technology. I would like to ask a question to the audience. Who here can actually live without their phone for one full day if I take it right now? There you go. How many can do it in 1 week?
Do you know, Othman, I don't believe them. We did,
These are definitely the early adopters.
Yeah, exactly.
We did a similar exercise with young people in that council, and we asked them to stop for 3 hours and just live their life as normal. And they're like, this is so frustrating. I'm so frustrated. Just 3 hours. So.
Yeah, honestly, one of the best ways to test this, if you send a notification to all of the attendees, and then you look at their faces and see which ones actually look at their phone, and you'd figure this out. But in reality, this is a challenge that I think young people will live through. And imagine now with your younger siblings, how will this be affecting them? Now, when you look at a notification, you are essentially being hacked through social media, through your brain. I mean, utilizing the cheap dopamine this way. And this has a huge effect. And this is why I'm pushing for policies to actually remediate this, either within the G20 or within the ITU.
Amazing. Lars, we often talk about Gen Z with terms like, hey, they're ripping up the playbook. They're rewriting the rules. We don't know what's next. Is that true? And in what ways is it true?
Well, Gen Z is the first generation to grow up in a world where all they know is technology. And so as a result of technology, it is magnifying the issues of our planet, the social issues, the economic issues, and the climate crisis. So for Gen Z, it is more important to them than almost any other generation to find their truth and their meaning in this world that is driven by misinformation, that is driven by an explosion of choice. And I think that the older generations, and I am on the cusp of Gen Z, misunderstand this desire for truth and this desire to stand up for what we believe in as ignorance. And I think that we need to give Gen Z more power to use these platforms and to share their voice for the future, because they're the ones that are going to have to pick up the pieces of the world that we are living in. And they have seen how capitalism has failed us. They have seen how health systems have failed us. And they are the ones that have a desire to change that future. And that is the hope, because they are the only generation that has a platform to do something like this. And that is the power of social storytelling.
Mm-hmm.
Speaking of picking up the pieces and a hope-filled future, I know, Chantelle, in your film, you've uncovered lots of reasons to be hopeful about the way that Gen Z is using technology in really inspiring ways. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, and it's following on pretty much from what Lars has said, that, you know, they are using these platforms, you know, in a way that exemplifies their values. So, you know, they're a generation that really do value kindness, fairness, justice, etc. And whilst loads of teenagers and other generations have valued these things, they do so much more. And so in terms of activism and using online social media for their activism, that is what we're seeing. And we follow that in the film. And so, for instance, we have Lucy Rydell, one of our contributors on TikTok, and she says, you know, millennials may have invented social media, but we're the ones who've weaponized it. And, you know, there really is an indication of that. A lot of people might have heard of the Trump rally, and they were expecting all these amazing numbers of people to turn out, and Gen Z got onto TikTok and alt TikTok, and they were like going, right, buy up these tickets or reserve these tickets to the Trump rally, you know, and show that you're going to show up. And of course, they just didn't appear. So all the numbers that people were expecting, they just weren't there. So it's a really great way of showing how they use social media and translate that into real world. And likewise in the UK, when we had the algorithm crisis and all these A-level students had their grades decided by an algorithm, so that an A-stream student suddenly had these really awful results. They weren't going to get into Cambridge, for instance, you know. And they translated that into turning out in person and protesting against it, which then overturned that whole decision, and the algorithms were put out.
I think that's the first TikTok reference I've heard, but you know, when you're in a Gen Z conversation, it is a nonstop murmur of the conversation, a real engine for change and possibility, potential, and also harm. You know, we're talking about a generation that is about 2.4 billion people, so it's really difficult to generalize. I mean, the range of experience and the diversity of experience of those young people is vast. Othman, you have great expertise in global and cultural differences based upon the work that you do. Can you tell us a little bit about some of those cultural differences?
Yes. So before, a generation is used to be defined as you being born in a place and then at a time period. But with technology nowadays, it almost, my brother Saud, for example, could have more in common with, you know, somebody in India, but actually at the same age, rather than just to me. And this is one of the most powerful things about technology, but it's also misleading. Because at one point, yes, they can all speak the same memeology language, but in reality, Saud lives here, not there. And so he has to deal with the challenges here and not there. However, when you look at social media and the way that it's being developed, it looks at it from a cultural perspective that is from the area that it originates from. And even filtration of such content, it usually is related to the people that actually filter that content. So what if actual content that is within the region okay, but in the West, for example, or in the East, not okay? Will it be filtered or not? And so this whole question comes up quite a bit. And I know that we're, you know, for example, here within the GCC, we have among the highest Twitter penetration rates of anywhere in the world. And we are ridiculously open as young people to really get onto the next thing. Who remembers Clubhouse? Yeah, exactly. So Clubhouse, like if you guys remember, everybody was like, I can't, send me the link. Who can send me my email? Put it on my phone number. Right now, I want to get in. And then it went up and it faded away. And this just tells you like how fast that we can adopt and really gain technologies here. And I think this is one of the things that really changed or is very different in the Arab world than in other areas around the world. But also how we use technology is very different. For example, within the Arab world, Facebook is almost negligible in terms of usage. But for example, WhatsApp is ridiculously utilized here for any shape or form in terms of communication. And COVID has really shifted the way that we use technology as young people, but also the elder generation. And within, for example, countries, in developing countries, this is also used as a tool for activism quite a bit too. So there are these cultural differences that really come into play. And one example that I really like to mention here is during the G20 in 2020, we had the Saudi presidency of the Y20 here in the kingdom. And it was the first presidency within the Y20 that was actually held online. So you had 77 delegates from all over the world, young people, trying to essentially advocate for their own policies, but in an online setting for the first time. What really shocked me is that I was part of the physical Y20 in Tokyo just a year prior, is the level of tone and level of risk of content or words that they would say is much higher in an online setting than it is in an offline setting. And this was much more prevalent in delegates from developed countries than it was from delegates from developing countries. So there are some really interesting, I think, cultural challenges when it comes to technology, and each culture has its own unique uses, and I don't think companies are really aware of that.
That's amazing. Larissa, Chantelle, do you have anything to add based upon your observations of different cultural orders of Gen Z and their use of technology?
Yes, I think one of the biggest things that we're seeing on TikTok is the shift from transparency and authenticity into an era of shock culture. And there is this pressure for teens to not just to be authentic and to be radically authentic, but to actually create shock value. There's an example of an influencer in the United States who started a Gen Z period company and quite literally shows videos of her period on TikTok. And she's amassed a global following of millions of people. And as a result, her brand is doing really well. If you look at a large corporation, they would have never taken that risk. And I think that because Gen Z is innovative and is driven by shock factor, it is putting pressure on brands to, one, innovate quicker, two, to align with the values of these Gen Zs, and to three, to really see those through. Because Gen Zs are going to have the majority of the purchasing power, and you cannot separate the social media economy from the capitalist world that it was built in.
Yep.
And these Gen Zs are walking commodities, and they are dictating the way that brands are functioning in the future of how we will purchase and engage.
So far, it sounds like Gen Z is just running full throttle towards this digital future. But I just want to quote Pamela Paul, who describes digital culture as a series of endless small transformations that arrive without warning and magnify a sense of everything being in flux. For fear of becoming social outcasts, and we know that young people are always concerned about fitting in and belonging, so being a social outcast is quite a challenge. What young people, and people generally, might never do is take a step back and say, wait a minute, what did we used to do here? What could we do here instead? What are some of the areas you are seeing that Gen Z is taking a step back and questioning the direction that digital well-being is headed?
So in our world right now, when you think about our digital identities, which is how Gen Z ultimately defines themselves and how they're shaped in the real world, it's a series of different interactions and different things that influence those identities, from filters to influencers to now the rise of meta-influencers and the shift from the real to the hyper-real through companies like virtualhumans.org. And this shift is creating this new type of digital abstraction and this idea that young people and the way that we see ourselves is not only just about perfection and perfect skin, but now this hyper-real identity of the future. And a Gen Z is stepping back right now to look at that and analyze. And at Half the Story, we were doing a workshop with students in Japan, which Japan in that culture, they've really created a lot of these meta-influencers and avatars that, the Dior's and Gucci's of the world. And we asked them a question, do you feel more socially pressured by this perfect influencer or this perfect avatar? The results were astounding. Over 65% of them said that the avatar actually made them feel worse about themselves than the perfect wellness influencer in the United States. And that, to me, is concerning because we are seeing the shift into the new world, the metaverse. And I think Gen Z is stepping back and they're saying, hold up, Mark Zuckerberg, we don't know if we like this virtual, this 3D world because we're still trying to figure out life in 2D.
Yeah.
Amazing. I just want everybody to raise their hand if they knew the term virtual human before today, hyperreal, meta influencers. All right. I think we have a course that we're going to have to teach, Larissa. There's a lot of money next year, a little course. So I'm wondering, just based upon this like dynamic difference Gen Z has with the rest of the population, are we asking the right questions about digital technology and digital well-being when it comes to these younger generations? And I know we're talking about Gen Z today, but Gen Alpha is very quickly building their digital lives right now. They currently have access to those tools and an expanded opportunity at an even younger age. So are we asking the right questions? And if not, what should those questions be?
We're barely scratching the surface of asking the right questions. I think the main question right now that's being asked is whose responsibility is it to regulate? Is it like the government role? Or is it young people's role to try to be more disciplined and control what they try to utilize in terms of their social media presence? Or is it the educators who should really learn more about what they need to implement and also cut off the threshold for their children's usage? Or is it the companies that shouldn't utilize these algorithms to put people, or young people specifically, through addictive means? And this type of question actually just pushes the problem even further because it's actually everybody's responsibility. And everybody here has a responsibility on their own to try to improve. And I think one of the ironic things is that we, in our pockets, our phones, they are the best invention to push you forward towards life. Where if you look at it from a 50 years perspective in the past, you really had a lot of barriers to entry as an individual to really advance in your career. But now you have it in your pocket. However, it's a double-edged sword because you don't even, right now, it's very difficult to pay attention to even listen to a 45-minute discussion through anything really to learn about. And it's really difficult to push yourself, especially from post-COVID era. And I think that's the irony in the world that we currently live in. Another question that I think should be asked is how? Do I limit, what is the proper tools that I could utilize to really advance my knowledge in these areas? And really, the simplest answer is also the hardest answer, is that you need to do it yourself and research. The social media companies will not come to you and say, oh, by the way, in order for you to limit your time, this is what you need to do. Their system is based upon profit. And so this is something that you'll need to do yourselves. And also from a government perspective, this also has a huge implication because who's faster to innovate, the policymakers, or is it the social media companies that will input these algorithms? So
you're bringing up a really curious tension that I detect when I work with this Gen Z Council, and that's about agency and the sense of control. And so you're pointing out, yes, we're all responsible, we all need to participate, but increasingly these young people are telling us, look, I don't know what I just did. I just spent 45 minutes and I don't know where I was. I've just come out of this. So there is something challenging about this provocation you're making around who has control and agency over that digital life.
Definitely.
I think it's also the shift from the what to the why. When you think about the digital well-being conversation, on a first-degree level, the way that media paints the picture is about screen time and addiction. But in our work with teens, we don't start with what's your screen time and what you're addicted to. We start with the why. What is ultimately driving you to spend this time? And for us, one, it's because a lot of them are struggling emotionally. Two, it's because a lot of them can't name more than one friend that's close to them in the real world, yet they have hundreds of, in some cases, thousands of followers online. And the third piece is because they don't have an intention. They don't have a reason, whether it's to connect or to create or to be inspired. And So many of us, I'm not sure how many of you have ever participated or done the Artist Way program, which is about connecting to your inner child. I think the most frightful thing about the work that we do with teens is seeing that these teens, who are supposed to be the children, the cultivators of play and creativity, don't even know how to access that part of themselves because of this digital apathy. And apathy as a world and as a culture is destructive. And if we remain emotionally detached, we're going to continue to see violence and conflict and bullying. And we need to give young people the tools and the space to get back connected to themselves, expand that emotional spectrum so that they can then connect with others.
It's so interesting. Intuitively, young people understand that. 75% of young people tell us that emotional connections today are weaker than they were in the past, so they get this. I'd like to think ahead to the next 5 to 10 years, because tech is moving so fast, and this generation is growing up so quickly. What do you see as the potential impact of digital technology on young people's lives as we look ahead to that horizon? What's going to change? What's going to remain the same? What are the new challenges going to be? Chantelle, why don't we start with you?
Well, the feeling that I have, and this is just from my insights through the film, is that the main issue that is facing kids is how are the apps that they're on and the platforms that they're on being developed? Are they being developed first and foremost for humans' usage and with profit second, or at the moment, obviously, it's the other way around. So when you start looking at things that we've been talking in the last few days about, you know, the Metaverse and 3.0 and everything, and you look at that, it's all very well, but what will remain in place is that social media platforms are, by definition, not private. And so, you know, these kids are still going to be battling with the issues that they face by being constantly on social media, and the negative harms are still going to be in place. How we make that shift is pretty much the conundrum, I suppose, we've all been discussing in the last couple of days. But it doesn't seem like by changing technology or pushing technology forward and it developing at such a high pace is actually addressing the fundamental problem.
Yeah. So interesting. So we're talking about a sort of a loss of intention, some of these social skills that you're talking around, sort of play and amusement. What other things are you seeing on the horizon? Why don't we go with Othman?
So we did a study on future skills back in 2018 before COVID. And one of the things that really came up is these 5 areas of skills. One of them, of course, it's digital literacy. And there was a spectrum of skills. You would have, for example, you knowing how to program all the way to things like simulations and the like. But one of the things that came up with interviewing young people that are on the edge of innovation during this research is really around utilizing technology, not how the companies intended to utilize it, but actually how they wanted to utilize this technology based upon their own means. And so we see this, for example, in Discord. If you're a gamer, you're probably familiar with the platform. It's really now about community-based.
I mean, do people know Discord in this audience? Yeah, okay, good. We have to test these platforms.
Yes, so they're used now as a community-based communication tool, more so than just, you go in, you talk to your friends, and you just play a video game during the process. So we see this evolution of young people really utilizing these different platforms through, based on their own means or based on what their own wants are, as opposed to how they were intended to be utilized. And this could lead to, which is similar to Web 3.0, which is really decentralization of development by young people to these applications for their own usage and not relying on like blue chip companies to really develop that.
So interesting. We asked our Gen Z council about the metaverse, and they were very adamantly opposed to being invited into that space. They want to go to real concerts. They want to go to real festivals. There's this sense that digitization maybe has gone too far. Larissa, predictions?
Well, predictions. I have a number of predictions, but also a number of questions. And I think right now, one of the things that we're seeing in the headlines and even with Gen Zs is, as a result of things like TikTok, it's sensationalizing mental illness. A lot of teens are self-diagnosing themselves, going into doctors, saying that they have Tourette's syndrome. Some teens are actually getting tics. We also just had a conversation about how the next generation has the lowest EQ in human history. And my question is, what does that look like in the future? The future that I don't want to predict, but that is in my mind, is one where the rates of Alzheimer's and dementia are higher than ever. The rates of autism are potentially higher, and Asperger's, and a lot of these social and developmental issues that humans face. And we're not having those hard conversations because there's still so little we know about the biological impacts of these digital tools. The technology is 15 years ahead, and we're on treadmills just trying to keep up. I think the other question that I have, we talked a little bit about Web3 yesterday, and that is where a lot of my mind is spent right now, because it's glamorized in a lot of ways, right? We're seeing the shift. You know, we want Facebook, Instagram, all of these big guys out of the picture, and we want to take control. And I don't think we're looking at, like, what is that shift once everyone gets on these platforms and no one has systems in place for safety, no one has systems in place for accountability, and we're just relying on humanity. Because quite honestly, I feel like we can barely rely on humanity now on these social platforms with what's in place. And so, you know, the future will continue to write that story, and I think today, here, we are writing that, but we need to really continue to look at the hard science and the hard facts while projecting the future of how this will impact culture, context, and commerce.
Culture, context, and commerce. That's great. Triangulation. You said something earlier. Culture is 15 years ahead of, or tech is 15 years ahead of culture. We often talk about how culture is 15 to 20 years ahead of government. So there's a lot of time warping that we're thinking here, and there's a lot of alignment that needs to take place. We're just about out of time. Before we go, I'd like each of you to provide a call to action to our audience, whether that comes to interacting and engaging with Gen Z, or for Gen Z themselves who are in our audience today. Start with Othman.
Sure. I mean, I have two. The first is, if you're working with young people, the general type of engagement that I have with youth is that generally, people within positions of power talk about me. They don't talk to me. And this is what's driving a lot of the youth conversations to be separated. And we see this happening a lot, especially with the different generations that are happening now. And this is going to be increasingly happening as people become more digitally literate as well. And so that's the first thing, is try to talk to young people, especially if you're working in the field of education or employment. The second is more to young people themselves, and this is a question I get asked a lot. Well, you know, before even 2020, before COVID, we've been facing challenges on skills, on education, on employment, on all of that, and life was difficult. And then COVID comes along, and now it's even more difficult, so what can I do? And honestly, the response is you need to be the main driver of your own success. I know it's cheesy. I know you've heard it a billion times before, but honestly, it's the truth. You need to drive it. Because in a time frame that we have right now, you have all the tools ready at your disposal, and you can actually create that arena for you. And sometimes it really needs, you need to research on how you can get to where you want. And it's very, especially today, the institutions won't come to you. And if it's coming to you, it most likely will be too late. You need to create that own path for you. And I'm sure many young people today have their own wants and needs, and to fulfill that, you do need to do that.
Thanks, Othman. Chantelle, call to action.
I'm first and foremost a filmmaker, so to me, it's about awareness. And whilst we have got, everyone's got these 5-point, plans, and you start here and you go there. But the thing about awareness is that it needs to be continuous, and we all have tools, we all have abilities. Some of us are artists and some of us are scientists and everything in between. But most of all, we all have a mouth, and you're either going to use it here, or you're going to use it here, or you're going to use it in your film, or in that beautiful piece of artwork that we saw from Naima earlier. That's how you're going to get the message across, and it needs to continue to be put across. And we can't just sort of go, right, well, we've established awareness now, let's sort of get on with the other stuff. That is a very continuous line. I think that's important.
Great. Larissa.
When it comes to your everyday life, show, don't tell. Gen Z doesn't want to be told what to do. They want to find a way to live their truth, and they want to reach their highest potential. And if you can show them what the power of digital well-being will do, they will follow in those footsteps.
So just to review, talk with and to Gen Z, not about them. If you're Gen Z, become a driver of your own success, relentless awareness raising, and show, do not tell. Please help me thank our panel for their wonderful contributions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well done.